The first paper is we're delighted to welcome Dr. Mary Fraser from the University of Glasgow, who, after a very distinguished career researching kind of nursing, latterly at the University of Strathclyde. Taking a slight kind of change of tack, we're delighted to say, and has been for the last 10 years or so researching the history of police work in Britain. And the focus of her paper today kind of in some ways kind of builds upon her recent book that came out with Routledge at the end of 2019, Policing the Home Front 1914 to 1918. And thinking a little bit today about how police were kind of called into agricultural service in 1917, 1918. So police as ploughmen, 1917-18, how Britain's policemen helped local populations by their temporary release into agriculture. Mary, over to you for 20 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you very much to the Society for giving me the opportunity to speak about police as ploughmen, and I'm really pleased to do so. British police work has often been associated with surveillance, cautions and arrests, but they have had and still do have a role in helping people. And this study gives just one example of this help given to the population in times of great need in the First World War. This current work, which is ongoing and for which I've received a small grant from the Police History Society, came from my interest in the many aspects of the work of the British police during the First World War, when they took on many new roles, which while their numbers diminished dramatically. The questions I want to answer in this talk are: what was the issue that led the police to become ploughmen? What was the extent of this activity? And why were they considered suitable to undertake the work? This is the main source that I used. The primary source, the Police Review and Parade Gossip, which I still think is a brilliant title for a journal, and it's the organ of the British Constabulary. It was the most widely read popular weekly journal for policemen, published from 1893. It was the voice of the policeman on the beat and aimed to improve his professional status and image, along with his level of education. The news articles on what individual forces were doing was where I first found columns headed Police as Ploughmen or Police to the Plough. During March and April 1917, there were 28 such mentions, which made me think that this was a big deal and made me want to search further for what it was all about. So from January 1917, with the advent of the Lloyd George coalition government, interventionist policies developed, whereas the previous Asquith government was said to have a laissez-faire approach to the war. By January 1917, the war had dragged on for 2 years and 5 months, and the population was war-weary. Men of military age at this time, 18 to 41, who wished to join the military had long since done so. So that Britain had to develop many means of increasing the number of recruits into the army to maintain its fighting forces, including identifying key industries at home when manpower should be retained in order to maintain productivity, such as in munitions factories, while combing out men from those areas of work considered less important, for example, commerce. Throughout 1916, the massive and increasing shipping losses resulted from Germany's attempt to blockade Britain, as we were heavily reliant on imports of food products, such as wheat. For example, Britain received 81% of wheat, mainly from the Americas, which we made into bread, a staple food for around 80% of the population at that time. Britain only grew around a fifth of the wheat consumed in our bread. From the 1st of February 1917, Germany concentrated its efforts on unrestricted submarine warfare, which sunk increasing numbers of ships importing essential foodstuffs, including wheat. Furthermore, the agricultural workforce had been denuded, and this was patchy across the country, but mainly had been denuded. Although the exact numbers of men leaving agriculture for either the war or for more highly paid work in the munitions factories and other work is not known exactly. But by January 1917, the most extreme estimates put the manpower loss at around 45% by October 1916. And I'm grateful to Peter Dewey, who will be presenting a seminar to you later on in this series, for his detailed analysis of the agricultural manpower in World War I. Furthermore, Irish migrant labour, around 13,000 during 1915 and 16, had stopped by 1917 due to the effects of the 1916 Easter Rising. A further significant factor was the prolonged severe winter of 1916-17, which was blamed for an absence of potatoes for many months, noticeable from the shops and markets from mid-February 1917. Potatoes, along with bread, have been shown by both Barnard and Oddy to be the two staple items in the diets of around 80% of the population. So their decrease or absence was likely to be a serious blow. The lack of potatoes was said by farmers to be due to disease or rotting in the clamps. But historians such as Adrian Gregory say farmers withdrew them from sale due to government price fixing. In these circumstances, government devised two main strategies. To feed the nation, Roland Prothero, Minister for Agriculture from December 1916, later to be raised to the peerage as Lord Ernley, portrayed the urgent need to increase arable by claiming that 100 acres of arable land could feed 150 people for a year, whereas 100 acres of average quality grass could feed less than 15. Government strategy was to urgently plough fallow and disused land, and then plough selected pastures. Government took control of agriculture through the implementation of the 1916 Milner Report recommendations, which had established many war agricultural committees at county level as part of local authority structures. But these were often very large. For example, Cheshire had 27 members, and they were without executive powers. So January 1917, Prothero revised them into executive committees with 7 members only. But this was not always willingly accepted. Cheshire had 10 districts, and each wanted a representative, and they petitioned the board for an increase as a special case, which was disallowed. The committees were local arms of the Board of Agriculture, which sent a representative to attend each meeting. Under the Defence of the Realm Act 2L and 2M, the executive committees surveyed land and were charged with assisting farmers to cultivate their land for the maximum crop by providing labour, fertilizers, equipment, and horses, with severe penalties if farmers resisted. Some farmers were initially sceptical, particularly as replacement soldier labour in January and February was from agricultural companies, formed from men graded by the army as C3, and this was really only suitable for sedentary work. Some farmers returned them to the depots, saying they were either lazy and useless or physically unable. and they were insulted that these substitutes were to replace their fit, healthy men who'd been released into the army, and grumbled that they should not be asked to keep infirmaries. The second strategy was labour mobility, and this was enshrined in national service, headed by Neville Chamberlain from January 1917. It followed and encouraged the discourse of patriotism, everyone's duty to their country, to help in any way they could to win the war. So the main crisis arose from March 1917. Combined with the fear of starvation through constant daily publicity of cargo ships being sunk, shortages being seen of some foods in the shops and markets, including the absence of potatoes, led to industrial unrest. The government commissioned an urgent investigation into the causes, which reported in March-April 1917, finding the main causes was the soaring cost of price of food, with blame attributed to government failure to control the production, supply, and distribution of food, with accusations of profiteering. By mid-March, the long, hard winter relented, and ploughing could start, with a portrayal of real urgency, as only 6 weeks was said to be available to plough and plant spring crops before the end of April. The main release of soldiers, early March 1917, the army released a further 12,500 from the Home Defence Force. 250 were sent to each county area, many of whom claimed to be ploughmen, but when placed on the farms, only 3,000 were found to have agricultural skills. Many made false claims to avoid being sent to the front to fight, and many were highly unsuitable. Later reports show men being sent who had a background either as a piano tuner or a lift attendant. Farmers ridiculed the scheme of substitution. By April, a further 40,000 were released to the counties, all more carefully selected before being sent to the farms, so that they could provide appropriate skills to farmers, but were unreliable, as 18,000 were recalled before ploughing was complete due to army operations in France. Despite this level of substitution, farmers still complained of labour shortages. So all other avenues to help agriculture were explored. National Service sent letters to local authorities and other employers, and continually advertised with large advertisements in the press for substitutes into agriculture. Many local authorities were entreated to help and examine their workforce to establish who had appropriate skills. This slide shows National Service asking local authorities to help, and they had the highest proportion of men with agricultural skills, which were found in the police. My search for areas so far that released policemen showed that there were 11 released in England and 9 in Scotland, and I'll show you these in just a few minutes. So if anyone has knowledge of others, I'd be really pleased to hear from them to know about this. So here are the locations that the police were released from. The 11 locations in England, which you can see here on the left, represent 9% of police forces. And you can see that I've got numbers from many of them, but some of the numbers just don't seem to be available in any material. Oops, sorry, that's not what I want. And this number released accounts for around 500 to 600 policemen at this time. To date, I've not found evidence of release from Wales, although one report from Swansea said the Chief Constable was unable to help, as his force was depleted beyond a level he felt was appropriate. For each location, the numbers represented a large depletion. For example, according to the Chief Constable's annual report from Glasgow, they already had 732 vacancies in an establishment of 1,997, making the release of a further 90, around 7% of the remaining workforce, which was a significant contribution. Other locations are likely to have similar proportions, as by autumn 1915, according to the historian Clive Emsley, the police had lost around 20% of their workforce to the military from the provinces in England and Wales, and around 25% from the metropolis. Release into agriculture was of three types. The first type was full-time temporary, usually for around 2 months, although reports from Edinburgh show return was only just completed by July, making release of about 4 months. The police personnel records do not show temporary release, so the dates of return to police duties were obtained either from local newspaper reports or from the police review.
It's 5 minutes, Mary.
Okay, the second type was full-time semi-permanent. So there were 83 released from Birmingham, and they continued beyond 1917. Thirdly, encouragement by chief constables to help in holidays and off-duty time, such as in Liverpool. And all reports show that policemen were well accepted by farmers, and many were praised. For example, a quotation in the police review from a farmer in Birmingham spoke of his willingness and ability of his policemen, and this is a direct quotation. He thought he would lift the whole load of hay onto the rick at one pitch if he could have got it onto the hay fork. Also, a letter of thanks to Edinburgh from the Edinburgh police force from a large landowner was published in the Scotsman. So why would policemen be suitable? This next slide shows the Glasgow police force, Glasgow City Police Force. And this was the types of previous experience that the policemen gave on entry to the service. And at this time, policing was never a first occupation. And these data were taken from the police personnel records in the Glasgow archives. Column 1 shows the type of previous work, which the 398 men gave when they were recruited. This is nearly 20% of the entire police force. And this pattern was typical across Britain. Evidence from the Metropolitan Police at this time also shows the police particularly targeting recruitment to rural areas, to young farm workers who were seen as having the ideal qualities required of being robust and servile. The robust presence on the streets of policemen indicating the British authority figure. Furthermore, it was an increase in social status and also regular pay for a man to move from agricultural labour to policeman. Column 4 shows 227 men who remained in the service in February 1917. 191 of them were of military age, so that's just over 84%. So this shows why the police service were ideal to target to help agriculture. The proportion with previous agriculture experience was far higher in the police than in the population as a whole. So the question is, why would chief constables release into agriculture? The first one is that the agriculture was a top priority and therefore seen to need to keep manpower and policing was a low priority. Secondly, chief constables were continually pressurised to release men into the military, despite claims to tribunals and the Home Office that the service was working well below the minimum manpower. Thirdly, it was up to chief constables to decide who to release and who to retain. And there was rising hostility within the service about young recruits who'd started since the war began, hiding in the police to escape conscription. There was also increasing paranoia in the service about choices made by the chief constables of who should stay and who should go, with anxiety that being retained indicated favoritism, while being released was a punishment for bad behaviour. Fourthly, public pressure at young policemen on the streets. And there's a quotation in the Police Review where a woman approached a constable on the street saying, "Why are you not in the army? A young man like you ought to be ashamed of yourself," with a large and hostile crowd gathering round. So faced with these continual external and internal demands to release men of military age into the army, the police temporarily released some of them into industries of national importance, on condition that they were placed near to home so that they could be recalled in an emergency such as a riot, which the voluntary special constables were felt unable to control. There was also more chance that those released would return unharmed in anticipation of the end of the war and the return to a normal police service. So this was, I'm just finishing up now. This was the beginning of 1917, when apart from soldiers, the police were one of the only organised group of adults to help farmers. Other adults were not so readily organised or available at this time, for example, prisoners of war or women organised into the Women's Land Army. Although informally, many men with agricultural skills who'd retired returned to work. There's also evidence that the number of policemen temporarily working in agriculture increased as the year progressed, as by the harvest, the numbers in Scotland had doubled to 500, but there's no such readily available figures for England and Wales. It's also possible that they continued to work in agriculture into 1918, but records don't exist to show this. So thank you.